We're going to finish up the nervous system unit with our last lecture here today, and we're going to just focus on a couple terms, and then we're going to talk a little bit about ions and then the impact that different ion levels can have on the nervous system. But let's start with convergence versus divergence. So to converge means to come together, right? So for example, if I say the police converged on the crime scene, it means they came from all over the place and ended up in one spot, right? And then diverge means to separate. If I say, oh, our opinions really diverge when it comes to what goes on a pizza, that means you might think pineapple belongs on it, which is insane, and I think it does not. So we diverge there. So those terms really relate, in this case, to neurons and how they communicate with each other. So the first term is convergence. And convergence, or convergence, depending on how you want to say it, that is when you have two or more neurons giving information to a single neuron. And this is going to really relate to what I just talked about with summation and this idea of synaptic potential. So, for example, if I have this diagram here, I have, let's say, these three neurons. And I have three neurons here, and these three neurons are all communicating with this one neuron. They're converging on this neuron. So let's say this one's inhibitory, this one's excitatory, and this one's inhibitory. Well, what ends up happening is you have a scenario where if two of them are inhibitory and one is excitatory, this neuron is not going to fire off because the inhibitory neurons are keeping it hyperpolarized, keeping it far away from that negative 55 that it needs for an action potential. If I were to switch that, let's say, and have two excitatory and one inhibitory, well, now this neuron is going to be facilitated. It's going to have a much higher it's going to become much more depolarized, I should say, and much more positive neuron closer to that negative 55. So this is that idea of summation. The number of excitatory versus inhibitory are going to determine what happens to that neuron that is being communicated with. So this is considered convergence because you have multiple neurons all affecting one single neuron. The second possibility there would be divergence. And divergence is just the opposite idea. You have multiple neurons being stimulated by one single neuron. So when a single impulse is divided onto several branches of an axon, think of a motor unit, right? A motor unit is all of the motor fibers, muscle fibers that are innervated by a single neuron, and that is divergence. So this diagram really shows it to you pretty well. This would be divergence, where you have one single neuron that has its axon branch off to stimulate multiple neurons, which then stimulate more neurons. So that would be divergence. Convergence is just going to be the opposite. You have multiple neurons all converging on one, and these are all going to impact this one neuron's ability to function. And that goes to that idea of summation, which is that synaptic potential, IPSP versus EPSP. If there's more IPSPs, you're going to have less of a chance of having an action potential. If there's more EPSPs, you're going to have more of a chance. And then the last bit we're going to talk about here is the importance of ions. So we talked about ions in this class in many different areas. We talked about ions when we talked about muscle fibers. We talked about calcium. We talked about ions when we talked about the muscle unit. We talked about calcium, and we talked about the need for these different ions. And now we really talked about it a lot in this nervous system, right? We have ions, we have calcium, we have sodium, we have potassium. So let's talk about the impact of these levels. And that's why nutrition is so important. If you don't have enough of these ions in your system, they're called electrolytes, your neurons can't function correctly. So the first one we're going to talk about is calcium. So the first place that you need calcium, obviously we've talked about in this unit, is to release the neurotransmitters. So if you don't have enough calcium in your system, you can have action potentials all day long, but if there's not enough calcium to trigger the release of the neurotransmitter, you're not going to have a neuron able to communicate with another neuron. So calcium is really important for the release of neurotransmitters. If you don't have enough calcium, you don't have the ability to release neurotransmitters. Also, I didn't talk about this before, but calcium plays a role in sodium channels, actually. Calcium helps close sodium channels, and I didn't get into that because the mechanism's not that well understood, and that's a little bit beyond what I teach in this class. But it does have an impact in the ability of sodium channels to close. So if there's not enough calcium, what happens is those sodium channels stay open, and it becomes it's like the opposite of hyperpolarization. It becomes extremely depolarized, and it stays up in that higher range, so this neuron's going to be able to fire off over and over again. So essentially, it's the opposite of a refractory period. What ends up happening is that neuron is going to go into tetany. So you're going to end up with muscle cramps. So you end up having that fire off. It could be a muscle cramp. It could be a neuron causing a gland to fire off over and over again. But essentially, not enough calcium could lead to neurotransmitters being released, but it can also lead to sodium channels not closing. And if sodium channels don't close, that neuron's going to stay depolarized, and it's going to be able to fire off again over and over again. This really plays in with women and pregnancy. Women have to take a lot of times prenatal vitamins. They take these special nutrients because while they're making a baby, which as you can imagine, forming an individual inside of you takes a lot of energy and resources. They're building a skeleton, so that calcium is extremely important. So pregnant women tend to be deficient in calcium, and that's why pregnant women get cramps a lot. Their muscles cramp up for a lot of reasons, but one is the lack of calcium. So that's why it's important that women, when they're pregnant, they have a high calcium and a high vitamin D intake, and that helps prevent those cramps from forming. And then the last bit of information for the whole unit, we're going to focus on potassium. And potassium is really important for maintaining your neuron function. If you have too much potassium in your blood, that can be a problem. And if you have too little potassium in your blood, that can be a problem. So I'm going to finish up by talking about that. So let's say you have too much potassium in your blood. That is actually deadly. So this is kind of dark, but you've probably heard of people being put on death row before, right? And one of the ways that they would kill somebody in a death row scenario is they might give them what they call lethal injection, right? They give somebody this injection of a chemical and it causes that person to die. Well, you may not have known this though. What that is basically a very high dosage of potassium. So the actual shot that they give a person to cause them to die when they're being put to death because of capital punishment, it is actually just a high dose of potassium. So that lets you know how dangerous potassium actually is. It's used as lethal injection. So why would it be a problem? Well, let's take a look at our diagram here. So if I take a look here, let's say under normal circumstances, this is going to be resting potential, where you have more potassium inside, less potassium outside. When I want to have an action potential, I need to get it to that negative 55, right? So for example, if I want to keep it at resting potential, I should say I need to keep it at negative 70 millivolts. Well, one of the things that keeps it at negative 70 millivolts is the fact that there's less potassium outside, so these potassium ions are going to leak out, right? But let's say there's a whole bunch of extra potassium outside that doesn't normally exist there. Let's say I ate a whole bunch of bananas. What would happen now is this potassium's not going to want to leave anymore, right? Because there's a whole bunch more potassium out there. There's no longer that concentration gradient. So the potassium is going to stay in. And if the potassium stays in, it makes it more positive. So instead of it being at negative 70 for resting potential, it might be at let's say, negative 65 or negative 60. And that's going to cause it to have an action potential much quicker. So what ends up happening is those neurons fire off when you don't want them to. They become extremely depolarized because those potassiums aren't going to want to leave, and they're going to fire off like crazy. And that leads to muscle cramps, for one thing. It could lead to a muscle cramp. And what muscle do you not want to cramp the most? Your heart. And that's what kills somebody with the lethal injection. It makes their heart stop because the potassium levels go so high that the neurons depolarize and they just fire off over and over again, causing that person to go into cardiac arrest. So there's actually a number of bananas that are lethal. You may not have known this. I don't know how they came up with this number. I do know how. They figured out how much potassium is in a banana and how much is lethal. But the lethal dose of bananas, what do you think it is? Come up with a number? You probably guess low. It's actually 400 bananas. So if you eat 400 bananas, you run the risk of having a heart attack because of high levels of potassium. But basically what ends up happening is if you have an increase in extracellular potassium, it causes it to be much less negative because the potassium doesn't want to leave, and that causes that neuron to be extremely excitable, and you can go into convulsions, and your heart can stop. The opposite scenario would be less potassium. So let's say there's a whole lot of potassium missing. So if I go back to my diagram here, I end up with a scenario where there's more potassium inside and there's not as much outside. So what's going to happen is now way more potassium is going to want to leave than normal. And as more potassium leaves at resting potential, instead of resting potential being negative 70, it might be, let's say, negative 75. Or it might even be all the way down to negative 80. And what that does is it makes it hyperpolarized, so this neuron's not going to want to fire off. So if there's not enough potassium in the neuron, it's going to have the opposite effect. It's actually going to cause this to become more negative, which doesn't allow the muscles to contract. So, for example, if you've ever run a long race, like if you've done a marathon before, or if you've done a half marathon, they usually have water stations. Well, they also sometimes give you bananas during that. And the reason why is because your potassium levels drop while you're exercising and you're sweating. You sweat out potassium, right? You sweat out salt. So what ends up happening is by eating that banana, you're increasing your potassium levels in your blood, and you're allowing your muscles to continue to be used. So, real quick review. Calcium is going to cause, the lack of calcium, I should say, is going to cause no neurotransmitters to be able to be released. It's also going to cause those sodium channels to stay open and keep that neuron very depolarized. And then for potassium, if you have too much potassium in your blood, it will cause those muscles to convulse, or those neurons to fire off over and over again, because it becomes extremely depolarized because potassium doesn't want to leave anymore. So the neuron stays very positive. And if there's a decrease in potassium in the blood, that's going to cause that neuron to become more negative, because those potassiums are going to want to leave at a higher rate because there's even less potassium on the outside. And that's it. That's the unit. Thank you very much.